So this is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the scripture for April 10th. Sometimes the questions that are the hardest to answer are the questions that a kindergartner asked. And I think this is where that TV show that was on for a while, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader, came from. Because the questions that young people ask, that particularly elementary schoolers, are really profound. So one of these questions that you hear sometimes is, what's heaven like? And I think Paul sketches out a picture at the beginning of this chapter that raises more questions, if we're being honest, than it does offer answers. He says, and this is really interesting, that he's not permitted to talk about the things that were seen in paradise here. Now, what he's describing sounds a lot like what scientists describe when they talk about near-death experiences. And several people have had near-death experiences. Maybe you've had one, or you know someone who's had one, where you see something like great brightness, or you see your body as if you're a spirit who's above your body looking down in some way. And there's actually scientific studies put together on this. There's a great book called Imagine Heaven that was written by a fellow named John Burke, B-U-R-K-E. Our congregation is going to be examining that and some of the questions it raises over the season of Easter coming up here in 2020. But there's a lot of scriptural support along with scientific research on near-death experiences and the similar sense of awe and wonder, and also the inability to describe things that Paul expresses here that are also expressed in some other folks' near-death experiences. Now, many scholars believe Paul to be talking about himself here, even though he says, well, there's this guy that I know. It was one way of Paul to be able to boast about something that he experienced while distancing himself, while being able only to boast in his weakness. And so he's trying to do battle with the Corinthians kind of on their turf, as it were, to share the signs and wonders that he experiences too, but he's trying not to be a braggart or to be arrogant about it or egotistical. Being caught up to the third heaven, as Paul says, is really the same as being caught up to what we would call heaven. You see, ancient Jewish thought understood heaven to be split into three parts. There's the first heaven, which is the sky where the clouds and the birds are. There's the second heaven, which is like outer space, the cosmos, where the stars are, where the sun and the moon live. And then there's the third heaven above all of that, which is God's realm. And so when in Genesis it says, in the beginning God created the heavens, plural, and the earth, singular, that's some of what it's referencing. There are many heavens, the first, second, and third. And so Paul's talking about going up to the third heaven. That's God's realm. That's paradise. Now, Paul also then goes on to mention, and he doesn't do the third person here, he talks about it in the first person. He mentions the thorn that God has given him, along with these incredible signs and wonders that he's gotten to experience. Scholars have speculated any number of ideas about this thorn. There's a passage in Galatians, I believe Galatians 4, where Paul talks about how the Galatians would have, if they could, ripped out their own eyes and given them to him. And so some scholars have thought that Paul's thorn is that maybe he couldn't see too well. Other scholars think, well, Paul didn't take a wife, as was customary for a man of his stature and of his time. Maybe the thorn was that he had same-sex attraction. He was attracted to the same sex, is what I'm trying to say. Other scholars have thought that he's maybe a humpback. Whatever the case, there's really no evidence for any of these. These are just speculations. And so you can take them at face value, but there's not a whole lot of evidence one way or the other. This chapter, I think, though, brings up a really important question for us as Christians, which is when, if ever, should we allow others to force us into becoming fools, as Paul condemns the Corinthians for doing here? Is this similar in some way to what our culture considers victim blaming? And if so, it's something we should avoid, because it's wrong to blame the victim for something that they have no control over. But for Paul, I think that the better analogy is that he's interested in learning and discussing things of God sort of at the level of calculus, you could think of. Whereas the Corinthians right now are really interested in just having a spitting match as to, well, I can add these really big numbers together, or I can subtract these enormous numbers. And it's like, that's not the point, bud. And I think what Paul's doing here is he's coming down to beat them at their own game in order to say, look, this is a distraction, and look how easily I'm able to match you tit for tat. No, what's way more important is to learn the meatier matters of the law and of the Spirit. And while Paul can add and subtract big numbers, metaphorically speaking, that isn't the point. The point is that they're called to something much more important than what they're wasting their time with right now. Now I wonder, how do you imagine heaven? Are you excited? Are you terrified? Are you somewhere in between? What would you do if you got the same experience as Paul did in some sort of a vision of heaven? That's all for 2 Corinthians 12. On Monday, the 13th of April, we'll be looking at 2 Corinthians 13 and finalizing we'll be ending our study of 2 Corinthians. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.